What's growing on, gardeners? Squash plants like zucchini are one of everyone's favorite summer vegetables, but they can be quite challenging to grow because the plants can come with so many problems. Well, I'm going to put those problems to rest. On today's video, I'm going to show you how to grow the most incredible squash plants that you have ever grown before in 5 easy steps.
If you're new to the channel, please subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and check out my Amazon store and Spreadshop links in the video description for everything I use in my garden and awesome custom apparel and gear.
Step number 1 is simple. Do not plant your squash plants too early. The biggest mistake that I see gardeners make by far when it comes to growing squash plants is they start their seed or they put their transplants out in the garden at the same time they start tomato and pepper plants. They think, well, these are all warm weather crops. I'm going to start them all at the same time because they go out at the same time in my garden. Big mistake, because neither are true. I started all of my tomato and pepper transplants from seed on February 9th, actually while I was watching the Super Bowl, and today is March 22nd, so tomorrow will be the exact 6-week anniversary of when I sowed all of my seeds. Now, tomatoes take about 1 week to germinate, and your peppers take about 7 to 10 days to germinate, depending on the varieties that you're growing. So this is the size of a tomato transplant after about 5 weeks, and this is the size of a pepper transplant after about 4.5 to 5 weeks. Your tomato and pepper transplants are usually the right size to go out into your garden 6 to 8 weeks after germination, so the whole process takes about 2 months to get the perfect size tomato and pepper transplants. These are still a little bit small. They have about 2 weeks to go, but I timed things perfectly because my last frost date is in 10 days. So this is what you can expect out of your tomato and pepper transplants in terms of size, roughly 6 weeks after you sow that seed. Here's the problem. Your squash seeds germinate in only half the amount of time, and they are ready for transplant in less than half the amount of time after germination. This squash seedling that you see right here was planted from seed only 12 days ago. It hasn't even been 2 full weeks since I planted that seed, and it already has 2 true leaves, and it's practically the size of my pepper plant. Look at that. So if you started your squash plant at the same time that you start your tomatoes and peppers, your squash plants are going to be way too advanced by weeks, if not more than a month. Just look at it compared to this tomato plant. It is almost the same size, despite the fact this is 6 weeks after the fact and this is only 12 days after the fact. In fact, the roots on this squash plant are so advanced right now, this is a perfect transplant right here. I could put this out in my garden right now, only 12 days after sowing the seed indoors. So if you started your squash seeds at the same time that you started your tomato and pepper seeds, you're in a lot of trouble because these are going to be ready roughly 5 weeks before your tomato and pepper seeds. In fact, these are probably going to get so big, you probably will have to just throw them out and start all over again. But it gets worse. Your tomatoes and peppers are subtropical plants. They can take chilly temperatures as long as they are brief and there are no frosts and freezes. So if you have a few nights drop to 39, 40 degrees very briefly and then it warms up during the day, your tomato and pepper transplants are going to be just fine. Not so for your squashes. Your squashes are distinctly tropical plants. They do not like spending any time at all underneath 50 degrees. So you're going to run in extra sorts of trouble if you started these things at the same time, because while your tomatoes and peppers can go into your garden after your last chance of frost date, you don't want to actually transplant your squash until a couple weeks after that, so you give the nighttime temperatures a little bit of time to moderate and get warmer. Besides, there's no big rush to get your squash plants out into your garden anyway. Things like tomatoes and peppers, they can take anywhere from 70 to 85 days after you transplant them to give you ripe fruit in most cases, unless you're growing really early varieties. But your squash plants are often somewhere between 50 to 65 days to maturity from the day you transplant it. So even if you transplanted your tomatoes and peppers out 2 weeks into your garden before you put out your squash plants, you will probably be harvesting your squash before you pick any tomatoes or peppers. They grow really quickly. Obviously, things like winter squash with very long days to maturity are an exception to that, but if you're growing winter squash, you don't really put that out into your garden until late spring anyway. So please, don't rush your squash plants out into your garden. This is one of the cases where the early bird does not get the worm. Now, that being said, step number 2 is to choose early varieties of squash for your first planting of squash out into your garden. And the reason why we want to do this is we want to pick early maturing varieties so we are harvesting them before things like the squash vine borer and squash bugs become active. Early in the spring, you are not going to have much pest pressure that usually comes in at some point in early to mid-summer. So if you can get harvest going out into your garden by growing early varieties first, you can actually grow them in a fairly pest-free environment. This year, I'm growing 2 very early and disease-resistant varieties of zucchini called Sanabria and Dunja. They are an incredible 41 days and 47 days to maturity. That is really early, folks. So when I get these plants out into my garden, they are going to start blooming and they are going to start producing fruit long before I have issues with things like squash bugs and vine borers and other invasive pests in my garden. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. You may be thinking, you just told me not to rush my plants out into my garden because of the weather. Now you're telling me try to get ahead of pest and disease pressure by getting them to fruit as quickly as possible. Isn't this contradictory information? You see, this is really why it can be challenging for some to grow squash, because you shouldn't really plant them out into your garden until about 2 weeks after your last frost date, so you give temperatures a little bit of time to warm up. But if you wait too long and you grow later producing varieties, well, now you're going to start competing with the pests that want to attack your squash plants. So you're really trying to thread that needle and get ahead of the game and time everything out properly. So here's what I recommend. Your first crop of summer squashes like zucchini or yellow squash, something like that, choose varieties that are very early, that have days that are less than 50 days to maturity, and start them from seed about 2 weeks before your last frost date. That will get you very nice sized transplants that will be ready to go out into your garden about 1 to 2 weeks after your last frost date. Then you plant them out into your garden then. That way you give temperatures a little bit of time to moderate, but you're growing very early varieties that should start fruiting for you in a rather pest-free environment. That is the needle that you want to thread to really get good early production in the beginning of the year. But at a certain point in the year, it's not going to matter anymore. The pests are going to be fully active, it's going to start getting very hot and or humid, and your initial plants that you plant are going to start taking damage from the weather and from insects. And that is where step number 3 comes in. That is to plant successive crops of squash all throughout the season. Do not try to keep the initial plants that you plant in your garden in the beginning of spring alive throughout all of summer. It is completely pointless. This is why up to this point I have talked about your first crop of squash. I probably plant 4 different crops of squash throughout the year. I like replacing the plants every 6 weeks because your squash plants, they germinate quickly, they are ready for transplant quickly, they fruit quickly, and they live a short, fiery life. They die quickly. Trying to keep them limping along when they're covered in powdery mildew or they're being attacked by squash bugs and vine borers, it's totally pointless. You're going to get lousy production. Simply start some new successive crops of squash elsewhere in your garden. Here's what I do. After I transplant my first crop of squash plants out into my garden, roughly 1 to 2 weeks after my last frost date, I will go inside and I will start some new seeds directly on a seedling heat mat. Or if it looks like we're going to have a really warm second half of April, I can alternatively direct sow some squash plants somewhere else in my garden. That way, once my first crop of squash plants start producing food for me at some point in early May, May, well, the other squash plants will be coming up and growing and be decent sized by then. So when the first crop inevitably bites the dust, I will be able to look forward to that second crop, which will be coming into its own. Basically, start new squash plants from seed every 4 to 6 weeks to replace the ones that are out in your garden growing currently. But don't replace them in the exact same location. Dedicate another location so they can get up and running and start establishing while your first crop or your second crop or whatever crop you're eventually going to replace continues to fruit and run its course. That way you always have young, healthy plants that are actively growing in your garden to get maximum production, and you aren't trying to squeeze the last little bit of life out of beaten up older plants. Step number 4 to have incredibly healthy squash plants and great production is to fertilize them every 14 days or roughly twice a month, give or take. Remember how I told you how fast squash plants germinate, grow, and start producing for you, growing into big plants with harvests after as little as 41 days with some of these varieties that I'm growing? Well, that comes at a cost. They demand a lot of nutrients from your soil. So if you aren't putting back in what they are taking out, you are eventually going to have a decline in production. So you have to feed them well if you want them to feed you well. So how should we fertilize our squash plants? Well, I'll tell you how I do it. And I do this for my tomatoes, my peppers, my cucumbers, my squashes, my watermelons. I follow this exact routine. Again, the frequency will be twice a month, every 2 weeks. And if you want to be 100% organic, I recommend you get yourself a good all-purpose organic granular fertilizer, such as this Espoma Plant Tone, something around a 555 NPK. It doesn't have to be exactly 555. This is a 533. As long as all of the numbers are roughly close together, you should be just fine. Then I like to supplement that with an organic bone meal product. Bone meal is, as the name implies, made out of bones that are dehydrated and then ground into a powder to help it break down more quickly. And this is a fantastic source of calcium and phosphorus. Phosphorus is essential for the blooming cycle. That's the macronutrients that make the blooms and the fruit, and they also lead to stronger, healthier roots. Then after I add my organic granular fertilizers to the soil at transplant, and every 2 weeks after that, I like to water them in, wet them down with something like Alaska fish emulsion. Fish fertilizer is my favorite of the water-soluble fertilizers. So you simply mix that into a watering can at a rate of about 2 to 3 tablespoons per gallon, and then you will water the plants in with that. I will show you how to do this at the end of the video, and if you're curious where to get products like these, I'll place links to them down in the video description for your convenience. If you're not concerned with being 100% organic, a good water-soluble fertilizer that you can mix into a watering can is something like Jack's 20-20-20, or if you want to just grab something off of the shelf at a big box store, you can use the Miracle Grow tomato fertilizer, which is 18-18-21. I generally recommend an organic approach, but ultimately my goal is to get as many people to garden as possible. So if organic gardening is a big barrier to entry for you, those are acceptable substitutes. Now, no matter what you do, I do recommend that you always use an organic granular fertilizer because they break down and they feed the microbiome in your soil. So you really need that item at a bare minimum. It is a healthy soil builder. The water-soluble fertilizers like Jack's 20-20-20 and Miracle Grow products, they do not do that. They only directly feed the plant because they are processed fertilizers. I strongly recommend that you use the granular organics no matter what. If you can't afford to be 100% organic, things like Miracle Grow tomato or Jack's 20-20-20 is a good substitute after you apply the organic granular fertilizers. The most important thing is that you garden in your backyard. So don't let people tell you that you can't garden if you can't be 100% organic. Just do the best you can. Anything you grow in your backyard is going to be better than what you get at the grocery store. And step number 5 is to protect your plants with insect netting once pest pressure becomes undeniably terrible in summer. Eventually, we all get to the point where the squash bugs and the vine borers become so bad, there seems to be nothing we can do about it. And to be honest with you, out of all the years that I have ever been gardening, I have never been able to truly defeat vine borers and squash bugs. They are an inevitability. The only thing we can really do is cover the plants with insect netting once that time of the year comes and keep them off our plants that way. However, there is an unfortunate downside when you do this. Your squash plants have separate male and female flowers, and pollen has to be carried from the male flower, which is a standalone flower, to the female flower, which will be a little baby squash that has a flower attached to it. And the way this is done in nature is with pollinator insects. So when you cover your plants with insect netting, you will unfortunately block those pollinator insects as well. So you will have to manually hand pollinate the plants at this point if you want to get fruit. Otherwise, you will have healthy pest-free plants that aren't producing any squash. Now, the process itself is really simple. All you have to do is just take a mascara brush or a blush brush or a small paintbrush and dust the pollen in the male flowers and then touch the insides of the female flowers with it. That's all you have to do. So generally speaking, you'll want to go through your garden every single day, remove the insect netting, and just do that manual pollen transfer. And if you're not saving the seed, it doesn't matter which male flower you take the pollen from. If you have male flowers blooming on all different plants that are all different varieties, if all you care about is just getting zucchini, you can take the pollen from any available male flower on any squash plant that is the same species. So obviously you're not going to be able to take pollen from a butternut squash and pollinate a zucchini with it, but as long as you take pollen from a zucchini, you can pollinate another variety of zucchini with that. Just keep in mind, any seed you save is going to be a hybrid seed if you do that procedure. Yes, I know it is an extra step. It's something else that we'll have to do, but unfortunately, if you want to keep your plants relatively pest-free and have them survive during the heart of vine borer season, this is really the best solution. But that being said, you still will need to occasionally check your plants over for bugs, because if bugs laid eggs on the soil line or in the mulch, they will hatch underneath the insect netting and they will be trapped in there. So you will need to still check your plants for pests regularly, but that insect netting does do a bang-up job at eliminating most of them. So now that I've given you my 5 biggest tips for the best squash plants of your life, I am going to show you how to plant and fertilize a squash plant. Now, I'm still 10 days away roughly from my last frost date, so normally I wouldn't plant my squash out in my garden for another 3 to 4 weeks, but this is an extra plant that I started just to make this video for you all to get ahead of the season. But I do have a trick up my sleeve that I'm going to share with you all that will allow me to plant this squash plant before my last frost date and still have success. I'm selecting a spot in my garden that is right up against a drip line emitter for irrigation purposes, and I'm just going to take my hands and I'm going to dig down and make sure I fluff up that soil. Then I'm going to take this peat pellet and I'm going to remove this paper that's on the bottom. Many say you don't have to do that, but I find it helps. Now, in this container right here, I have a fertilizer blend that I made. This is 3 parts organic all-purpose fertilizer and 1 part bone meal. So I'm going to take one of these scoopers and I'm going to put a rounded scooper, which is equal to about 2 tablespoons of fertilizer. So this would work out to be about 1.5 tablespoons of organic all-purpose fertilizer and a 1/2 tablespoon of bone meal. And I'm going to dust the planting hole and the bottom of the root ball. And I'm simply going to press that down, sprinkle a little bit of fertilizer as a top dressing on there, and then I'm going to place my tag. Then I'm going to water the plant in with this fish fertilizer. So I'm going to shake it up and I'm going to put a couple of tablespoons inside this watering can. This is a 2-gallon watering can. That was probably something like 3 tablespoons. Then I'm going to fill it with water and I'm going to mix it around really well. You have to make sure the fertilizer has been well incorporated and completely dissolved evenly into the water. And then we will water in our plant very well with the fertilizer. Usually a 2-gallon watering can is enough to water in a dozen new transplants. Now I'm going to show you how I will keep this plant alive and happy even though we are 10 days before my last frost date. And this method will only work if you're not going to get any more freezes. I'm definitely past my risk of freeze. It is possible that we could get light patchy frost though over the next couple of weeks, and this method should keep it alive. Tonight's temperature is going to be in the low 40s, which is usually much colder than these plants would tolerate and could even kill the plant, but this method will work to protect it, and that is using the milk jug greenhouse method. I've been doing this for years by cutting out the bottom of a milk or water jug and leaving the cap off. You can create a mini greenhouse that will insulate it during the night and also trap more heat during the day to help warm it up, but you won't cook the plant alive because we're leaving the cap off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back the soil around it because we need to lock this greenhouse into the soil. If it blows away, our plant will be in big trouble. So I'm going to press it down, then I'm going to pack the soil around it, which will also help further insulate the plant. Then I'm going to use one of these metal stakes and I'm going to push that through the ground, and that is going to prevent that milk jug greenhouse from ever blowing off. So we'll keep this on the plant for probably the next 2 weeks or so, and that will get us beyond our last frost date. Any longer than that, and this plant is going to outgrow that milk jug greenhouse. So this is a great trick. I've been using it for years on many different plants. It can buy you a couple of weeks. Now, just to be clear, I do not recommend that you risk your main crop of plants using that milk jug greenhouse trick because it does have a significant risk of failure. However, if you have some extra plants or you want to start some plants a few weeks early just to risk them out in the garden, well, then you have nothing to lose. And I have been very successful with this method for 4 years going throughout the past. So if you do get it to work, you will be handsomely rewarded with extra early crops during a period of time where there is minimal pest and disease pressure. And that right there are 5 tips to have the best squash plants of your life. To the regular viewers of my channel, if I sounded a little more tired and less enthusiastic on this video, I apologize, but I am in the midst of a massive garden teardown and rebuild, and today I spent all day putting down a weed barrier in the sunshine, so I'm pretty beat up, but I wanted to get this video filmed for you to get it ahead of squash season for most people, so you get these tips. I'm feeling great. Everything is looking fantastic, and I think this is going to be the best year ever. So everybody, I sure hope you did find this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please ring that notification bell so you're notified when I release more videos like these. If you have any questions about growing squash or any of the concepts I mentioned in this video, please ask them down in the comments below and I will do my best to address them. If you're curious about any of the products that I featured in this video or that I use to grow squash, I will place direct links to them down in the video description. For everything I use in real life in my garden, that is linked in my Amazon storefront in the video description. So expand the video description, click on the Amazon storefront link, and you'll see everything I use in real life. And while you're down there, please consider checking out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video.
It's time to fire up the Dale for the day. Oh, there he is! Oh, what does Dale want? You're not supposed to be on top of the dryer, Dale. Well, I can't even get you in frame. Show me what you want, Dale. Show me what you want. You missed! Yeah, you kind of got it. All right. Dale, the camera can't even pick up the frame rate of your tail. Look at that. That is one heck of a frame rate, buddy. Oh, there we go. I need a high-speed camera to get how happy Dale is. All right, let's go for a walk on this beautiful day.